And I'll read to you the Research Unit for Political Economy, located in Mumbai, is constituted under the People's Research Trust, which is a registered public trust. The RUPE runs on voluntary labor and limited finances raised from personal contributions. It is not affiliated to any other body. The Research Unit for Political Economy is concerned with analyzing at theoretical and empirical levels various aspects of the economic life of India and its institutions. It aims to compile, analyze, and present information and statistics so as to enable people to understand the actual mechanics of their everyday economic life. And in this, it aims to take the assistance and insights of people engaged in every sphere of productive work in society. The RUPE publishes Aspects of India's Economy, a journal which aims to explain day-to-day issues of Indian economic life in terms that can easily be understood and to link them with the nature of the country's political economy. Now, we have some back issues here of Aspects. The most recent number of Aspects is the one in which my paper on the Bill Gates Foundation and public health and imperialism appears. We don't yet have number 57 off the presses. However, it is available both. I printed out a number of copies. They're in a stack over there. And it's also available at the website of the research unit, which is RUPE-India, rupe-india.org. And I would ask you all to look at the research unit as a resource for information both about India and about the global South in general, and how it's relating to the imperial core and the effect that that has on real people in the periphery. So that's the sponsor of this panel, and I should also mention, yes, you're welcome to take these back issues here and have a look. We also have a few fairly hard to get books that if you're interested in looking at them, I can show them to you after the panel. For those, we would ask, the suggested contribution, which will go to the research unit, is $5 for the books. These you can feel free to take. So,
where are the books, did you say?
I'm sorry?
Where are the books?
Right now, the books are in this bag. I didn't want to lay them out on the table because I thought it would imply I'll go ahead and take them. But afterwards, I'll put them out, and if anybody's interested in taking them, go ahead. I recommend in particular, there's a book called The Himalayan Adventure by Suniti Ghosh, who was an absolutely terrific historian of 20th century India, and this is about the Indo-Chinese War. And this is a perspective on the Indo-Chinese War that you're not likely to get in the mainstream. Suniti Ghosh just died about 4 weeks ago, and the tributes to him, the work that he did in the context of doing an alternative, sort of bullshit-free history of South Asia over the last 40 years were really impressive. He's a man very much worth knowing. So,
can you repeat his name?
Suniti Ghosh, Ghosh, and actually if you go to the research unit website, there's a tribute to him online. Or I can ask me afterwards, I'll show you where to go, because I think that may actually be on the WordPress blog rather than the site that I just mentioned.
I wrote down Research Unit for Political Economy.
Yes, and this stack?
Oh, that's what Rupe is.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, you have one?
Yes, I do.
All right, well, we will get started. Thank you all very much for coming. What we're going to be talking about today is an issue of, I think, critical importance. It is one of those areas in which the relationship of good, solid information to marketing, branding, and BS is extraordinary. That what people hear about the activities of supposedly charitable foundations in the global South is about 99% lies. And this is one of the things that all of us panelists are going to be discussing today. I'm going to begin with some remarks based on my paper in the most recent issue of Aspects of India's Economy about the history of foundations and U.S. imperialism and Western imperialism in general. My name, by the way, is Jacob Levich, and I have frequently written for the research unit as well as for other publications which you might or might not be familiar with. In real life, I'm a university administrator. The pattern of large-scale philanthropic activities was set in the U.S. about a century ago when industrial barons such as Rockefeller and Carnegie set up the foundations that bear their names, to be followed in 1936 by the Ford Foundation. As Joan Roloff has argued in an excellent book called The Mask of Pluralism, during the past century, large-scale private philanthropy has played a critical worldwide role in ensuring the hegemony of neoliberal institutions, while reinforcing the ideology of the Western ruling class. Interlocking networks of foundations, foundation-sponsored NGOs, and U.S. government institutions like the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, work hand-in-hand with imperialism to subvert people-friendly states and social movements by co-opting institutions deemed helpful to U.S. global strategy. The role of big philanthropy in the context of imperialism, however, is broader, and even seemingly benign endeavors by foundations, such as their century-long commitment to what they call public health in the global South, can be understood as something that is not benign and is in fact deeply implicated in the process and the fact of imperialism. Schools of tropical medicine were established in the U.S. in the late 19th century with the explicit goal of increasing the productivity of colonized laborers while ensuring the safety of their white overseers. And let me quote from a journalist who wrote in 1907, "Disease still decimates native populations and sends men home from the tropics prematurely old and broken down. Until the white man has the key to the problem, this blot must remain. To bring large tracts of the globe under the white man's rule has a grandiloquent ring, but unless we have the means of improving the conditions of the inhabitants, it is scarcely more than an empty boast." And this shows you that as early as 1907, philanthropic endeavors that were purportedly meant to improve the lives of people in the colonized and in the post-colonized world always had an agenda. And that agenda had to do with the extension of imperial power and the extraction of resources from what was then called the Third World. So precisely the reasoning embodied in that quotation I just read to you underlay the formation of the Rockefeller Foundation, which was incorporated in 1913 with the initial goal of eradicating hookworm, malaria, and yellow fever. And they were quite explicit about what they were up to. This is a quote from Rockefeller's International Health Commission about how successful they were in yielding increases in profit extraction, because each worker could now be paid less per unit of work, but with increased strength was able to work harder and longer and receive more money in his pay envelope. So enhanced labor efficiency was really the goal of eradicating hookworm, malaria, and yellow fever, but there was more. Enhancing labor efficiency was not necessarily critical to capitalism in the context of areas where there was a vast pool of unemployed and underemployed labor. The other critical point about eradicating these tropical diseases was to provide greater scope for future U.S. military adventures in the global South, where occupying armies had consistently had problems with contracting tropical diseases. At any rate, as Rockefeller expanded its international health programs in concert with U.S. agencies and other organizations, additional advantages to the imperial core were realized. Modern medicine advertised the benefits of capitalism to backward people, undermining their resistance to domination by imperialist powers, while creating a native professional class increasingly receptive to neo-colonialism and dependent on foreign largesse. As Rockefeller's president observed in 1916, For purposes of placating primitive and suspicious peoples, medicines have some advantages over machine guns. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, public health philanthropy became closely aligned with U.S. foreign policy as neocolonialism embraced the rhetoric, if not always the substance, of development. Foundations collaborated with the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, in support of interventions aimed at increasing production of raw materials while creating new markets for Western manufactured goods. A section of the U.S. ruling class, represented most prominently by Secretary of State George Marshall, argued that, quote, increases in the productivity of tropical labor would require investments in social and economic infrastructure, including greater investments in public health. Meanwhile, the seminal Gaither Report, commissioned in 1949 by the Ford Foundation, had explicitly charged big philanthropy with advancing human welfare in order to resist the tide of communism in Asia and Europe. And so by 1956, a report to the president by the International Development Administration Board was openly framing public health assistance as a tactic in aid of Western military aggression in Indochina. So for a time, therefore, Western philanthropy worked to shape public health systems in poor countries, sometimes condescending to relinquish control of infrastructure and trained personnel to national health ministries. Although actual investment in third world healthcare was meager by comparison to the great promises of Cold War rhetoric, in fact, some response on the part of the core to health crises in poor countries was deemed necessary in the context of the post-war struggle for hearts and minds between the First and Second World. But the fall of the Soviet Union ushered in the present phase of public health philanthropy, which is characterized by the Western demand for what is called global health governance. And this is purportedly as a response to the spread of communicable diseases accelerated by globalization. Health has now been redefined as a security concern. The developing world is portrayed as a teeming petri dish of SARS, AIDS, and tropical infections, spreading disease and death across the globe, and requiring Western powers to establish centralized health systems designed to, and I'm quoting here from a journal, overcome the constraints of state sovereignty. Imperial interventions in the health field are justified in the same terms as recent humanitarian military interventions. And from the same journal, national interests now mandate that countries engage internationally as a responsibility to protect against imported health threats or to help stabilize conflicts abroad so that they do not disrupt global security or commerce. So providing support for national healthcare operations is no longer on the agenda. To the contrary, in keeping with structural adjustment programs that have bled dry public health programs and ministries throughout the developing world, health ministries are now routinely bypassed or compromised by public-private partnerships orchestrated by foundations like the Gates Foundation. As national health systems are hollowed out, health spending by donor countries and private institutions are exploding. And indeed, the Council on Foreign Relations anticipates the withering away of state-sponsored healthcare delivery, which is to be replaced by a supranational regime of, quote, new legal frameworks, public-private partnerships, national programs, innovative financing mechanisms, and greater engagement by non-governmental organizations, philanthropic foundations, and multinational corporations. So, the exemplar of philanthropy in this era of global health governance is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Vastly endowed, essentially unaccountable, unencumbered by respect for democracy or national sovereignty, floating freely between the public and private spheres, it is ideally positioned to intervene swiftly and decisively on behalf of the interests it represents. As Bill Gates once remarked, I'm not going to get voted out of office. And I will mention that that's very much in keeping with Gates's attitude toward democracy, which I think is revealed in the following quote: the closer you get to government and see how the sausage is made, the more you go, oh my God, these guys don't even actually know the budget. the idea that all these people are going to vote and have an opinion about subjects that are increasingly complex. And then he begins to ramble a little bit, but he ends up saying, do democracies faced with these current problems do these things well? So in effect, Bill Gates is horrified by the very idea of democracy, by the idea that people would presume to vote on issues which he feels that they are not qualified to understand. At any rate, although Bill Gates remains he's the co-founder of Microsoft Corporation and remains its chairman, and he is currently the richest man in the world, despite a lot of publicity that is meant to suggest that he's giving away his fortune. He's become richer every year since 2009. And he's built the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation into the largest private foundation in the world and the most powerful. It dwarfs once dominant players like Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie. The Gates Foundation exercises power not only via its own spending, but more broadly through an elaborate network of partner organizations, including nonprofits, government agencies, and private corporations. It's the prime mover behind multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Gavi Alliance. We'll have more to say about the Gavi Alliance in a minute. But that's a public-private partnership between the World Health Organization and basically the vaccine industry. The Gates operation resembles nothing so much as a massive vertically integrated multinational corporation controlling every step in a supply chain that reaches from its Seattle-based boardroom through various stages of procurement, production, and distribution to millions of nameless, impoverished end users in the villages of Africa and South Asia. Emulating his own strategies for cornering the software market, Gates has created a virtual monopoly in the field of public health. In the words of one NGO official, you can't cough, scratch your head, or sneeze in health without coming to the Gates Foundation. Now, in order to illustrate how the Gates Foundation works and on whose behalf, I'm going to make some remarks about the Gates Foundation's vaccine programs. And my fellow panelists, who I will introduce after I finish talking, are going to be able to talk about other aspects of the sort of interlocking initiatives that the Gates Foundation sponsors and the ways in which these initiatives impact on the people of the Global South. But let me begin by talking about the vaccination program and the relationship between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Big Pharma. Despite annual revenues approaching $1 trillion, the global pharmaceutical industry has lately experienced a critical decline in the rate of profit. And for this, it lays most of the blame on regulatory requirements, in particular the very expensive phase 3 clinical trials, which are the mechanism by which the safety and efficacy of new drugs is meant to be tested. And in my paper, you'll see I have some quotations from the international consulting firm McKinsey & Company, in which they recommend to pharmaceutical executives that the time is now to stop running phase 3 clinical trials in U.S. and the West and to move them offshore to developing countries where drug safety testing is seen as relatively speedy, cheap, and lax. It's in this specific context that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's intervention in the distribution of vaccines and contraceptives must be seen. The foundation is heavily invested in Big Pharma, and it's well positioned to facilitate pharmaceutical R&D strategies that are tailored to what they call the realities of the developing world, where, quote, this is from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation literature, to speed the translation of scientific discovery into implementable solutions, we seek better ways to evaluate and refine potential interventions, such as vaccine candidates, before they enter costly and time-consuming trials. And if you really look and see what is implied there, in plain language, the foundation is promising to assist Big Pharma in its efforts to circumvent Western regulatory regimes by sponsoring cut-rate drug trials in the periphery. The instruments of this assistance are Gates-controlled institutions like the Gavi Alliance, the Global Health Initiative Technology Fund, and the Program for Appropriate Technology and Health, PATH. These are all public-private partnerships that are purportedly devoted to saving lives in the global south. They're also notionally independent, but they're so heavily funded by the Gates Foundation that they function as virtual arms of the foundation, supplying a sort of leverage. Supplying a sort of leverage that emulates the kind of strategic investment leverage that the Gates Foundation, that Gates learned to apply as chairman of Microsoft for. These are the ways in which Gates is able to use institutions like this as sort of force multipliers to increase its influence worldwide. After these organizations began to conduct large-scale clinical trials in Africa and South Asia in the mid-2000s, Africa experienced, quote, an unprecedented increase in health research involving humans who were typically poverty-stricken and poorly educated. Predictably, the results were lethal. In 2010, the Gates Foundation funded a phase 3 trial of a malaria vaccine developed by GlaxoSmithKline, administering the experimental treatment to thousands of infants across 7 African countries. Eager to secure the WHO approval necessary to license the vaccine for global distribution, GlaxoSmithKline and the foundation declared the trials a smashing success, and the popular press hailed it as a wonderful advance. But few bothered to look closely at the study's fine print, which revealed that the trials resulted in 151 deaths, and caused serious adverse effects, including paralysis, seizures, and febrile convulsions in 1,048 of 5,949 children aged 5 to 17 months. Citing additional and similar abuses, a South American newspaper declared, "We are guinea pigs for the drug makers." It was in India, however, that the implications of the foundation's collaboration with Big Pharma first rose to widespread public attention. In 2010, 7 adolescent tribal girls in Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh died after receiving injections of an HPV vaccine, that's human papillomavirus, as part of a large-scale, they called it a demonstrational study funded by the Gates Foundation and administered by PATH. The vaccines developed by GlaxoSmithKline and Merck were given to approximately 23,000 girls between 10 and 14 years of age, ostensibly to guard against cervical cancers they might develop in old age. Extrapolating from trial data, Indian physicians later estimated that at least 1,200 girls experienced severe side effects or developed autoimmune disorders as a result of the injections. They were not given any kind of follow-up care, and they were not given any kind of medical assistance. Further investigations revealed pervasive violations of ethical norms. Vulnerable village girls were virtually press-ganged into the trials. Their parents were bullied into signing consent forms they could not read by PATH representatives who made false claims about the safety and efficacy of the drugs. In many cases, the signatures were simply forged. And an Indian parliamentary committee determined that this Gates-funded vaccine campaign was in fact a disguised large-scale clinical trial, that they disguised it in order to get around statutory requirements, and they concluded that this constituted a clear-cut violation of human rights and a case of child abuse. Now, by thrusting the HPV vaccine on India, the Gates Foundation was not merely facilitating low-cost clinical trials, but it was also assisting in the creation of new markets for a dubious and underperforming product. Merck's version of this HPV vaccine, called Gardasil, was introduced in 2006 in conjunction with a high-powered marketing campaign that generated $1.5 billion in annual sales. The vaccine was named Brand of the Year by Pharmaceutical Executive for, quote, building a market out of thin air. Now, at first, yes, Gardasil. So at first, this marketing campaign was very successful, and people rushed to get this this vaccine for their children because they were told this will help protect your daughters from cervical cancer. However, very soon there were studies in JAMA and Lancet that revealed that not only were these injections quite risky, but that their efficacy was in great doubt. It was not really clear that these vaccines cured or prevented anything, and there was no valid clinical data suggesting that they did. Word got out, and as a result, by 2010, Fortune magazine was now declaring Gardasil a marketplace dud as year-over-year sales fell by 18%. Now at this point, you've got billions of dollars in profits and market capitalization at stake. This is when the Gates Foundation steps in. And its principal tool was the Gavi Alliance, which was launched in 2000 with the explicit goal of shaping vaccine markets. Gavi was charged with co-financing vaccine purchases with third world public health ministries, and meanwhile, quote, finding the type of large-scale funding needed to sustain long-term immunization programs, and laying the foundations that will allow governments to continue immunization programs long after Gavi support ends. In essence, the Gates Foundation is proposing to, and has done, buying up stockpiled drugs that had failed to create sufficient demand in the West, pressing them on the periphery at a discount, and locking in long-term purchase agreements with third world governments. Now, in pursuit of this effort to create a new market for this dud vaccine, the HPV vaccine, Gavi sponsored this big international board meeting in Dhaka, and they got Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, to come and propose a program whereby developing countries would be persuaded to agree to vaccinate up to 2 million women with HPV vaccine by 2015. And as a result, Merck by 2012 was able to report a 35% jump in Gardasil sales, reflecting inter alia favorable performance in Japan and the emerging markets where sales growth is being driven by vaccines. So evidently, a drug rightly deemed suspect by Americans would be good enough for women in the developing world. Now, the Gates program has, the Gates Foundation is up to some very similar things involving contraceptives, which Kwame Fosu will talk about in just a minute. I'll conclude by saying that I argue this much more extensively in my paper, and you're welcome to pick up a copy of it. But the Gates Foundation's interventions in pharmaceuticals, agriculture, population control, and other putatively philanthropic concerns is part of a broader agenda. And you get hints of it every once in a while. For instance, when Gates, in a recent interview, briefly strayed off message and started talking about warning of huge population growth in places where we don't want it, like Yemen and Pakistan and parts of Africa. I think his use of the majestic plural here is quite revealing. In spite of much rhetoric about empowering poor people, the Foundation is fundamentally concerned with reshaping society in the context of current ruling class imperatives. Now, I discuss this a bit more in my paper. Obviously, what we've got right now is a situation in which the U.S. is making an aggressive thrust into Africa and into South Asia. It is interested in gaining control of raw materials that are available there. They are also interested in dispossessing peasants of their land so that they can be consolidated and run by agribusiness in order to become a breadbasket for the first world. Meanwhile, well, I guess the point I wanted to make was that these interlocking programs of vaccines, population control, land policies are all things that are quite congenial to the current goals, the current program of Western imperialism.